Now the stage is yours.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Okay, there's a copy. This is a pretty text-heavy PowerPoint. I've been criticized in the past for breaking all the rules of PowerPoint, and I've done it again today. So, although for those of you online, I don't think that should be any problem. But if you're in the room and you're sitting in the back of the room, you might download it using the bit.ly address here, Rust Agency. And I'm going to begin with a discussion of this chart. I think this is a fascinating chart. This is out of Cognition about a year ago, and a couple psychologists asked about 800 people on Mechanical Turk concerning about 70 different entities to rate the relative personhood of those entities. Each entity received at least 100 votes, and this is how it cashed out, right? So of course, adults and infants, right, have full personhood. Rocks have no personhood, and everything else falls in between. Almost everything else. There. Notice that they also asked participants about corporate entities, which is something I'm going to be talking about today. Yesterday, Henry suggested that when coming up with theories of consciousness, it's really important to balance the folk intuitions with scientific investigations. I think this chart is a testament, right, to that of sage advice. There's some really weird features of this chart. Some of you probably see it already. For me, the strangest one that jumps out is that on average, a deceased man is ranked as having about the same personhood as an elephant. That's wrong, right? Sorry, folk, you've got it wrong. You know, and some other strange features. I don't know. This came out about a year ago. It would have been interesting if they redid this experiment now. I would like to see where people, where these Turkers would rate LLMs. They talk about robots. So there's robots and there's robots, right? So I don't know that that's that informative. If I were to do the study, I would actually add a bunch of other entities, right? Where would someone, for example, put a hurricane on this great chain of personhood? Right? Rocks just seems like the wrong place to start because rocks don't really do anything, right? But what about entities that do things like hurricanes or solar systems? I would be kind of interested to see if people attributed a little bit of personhood to them. Another thing that I would add, notice they asked about a ton of nonprofits and profits. We got Coca-Cola. Kind of a strange feature. It seems to me that the more morally balanced an institution is, right? The more the institution is perceived as good, the more personhood is attributed to it. Starts to get kind of a Kantian thought, right? There's a latent Kantianism in the background there. But I don't know why the investigators didn't ask about, for example, governments. You'll see that's going to be really important later on in my talk, right? How much personhood would we attribute to, say, the United States government or the US judicial system as opposed to Coca-Cola? I'd be interested in knowing. So there's some weird features of this chart, but also I want you to appreciate the way in which it's also not very weird. That in general, right, like I'm glad to see houseplants are down here at the bottom relative to dolphins, right? That's kind of my sense, right? So also appreciate the way in which, right, your intuitions may correspond with at least a significant subset of the folks' intuitions on these matters. I think there might be a little bit of bias in favor of those beings that we're familiar with, like cats and dogs. Anna tells me, right, here, fish get ranked just above ants, but Anna tells me in conversation that actually fish are super intelligent, and it's just we don't know enough about fish, so we kind of downgrade them. The name of the paper is called Corporate Personhood. Corporate Insecthood. And the reason why it's named that way is if you take the average of all the rankings of the institutions at the top, it's about 20, which is the same ranking as an ant, right? So on average, people attribute the same amount of agency or personhood to a corporation as they do to an ant, which is fascinating to me. And in this case, this is not a folk intuition I'm quite prepared to explain away, right? I am prepared to explain away deceased man, but this one, let's take it seriously for a moment. Let's see if we can make sense of the thought that maybe a corporation has a degree of agency. And that's going to be the task of this talk. Then I'm going to tie it back to LLMs at the end. But I'm by no means anything close to an expert when it comes to large language models. and AI. So that's going to be maybe the most speculative part of the talk. Okay. So I want to take the idea of corporate insecthood pretty seriously, right? What is the kind of agency that an ant has, and does that kind of agency apply to something like Coca-Cola or the United States government? Okay, so I'm going to posit a conception of minimal agency that's generic enough to potentially encompass not just persons, but insects, some institutions, and potentially some machines. And one of the reasons why I think this might be interesting to the present audience is that in some ways, institutions are the original artificial agent. Okay, we created them, and if they have agency, right, maybe they have agency in something of the same sense that another thing that we created, namely an LLM, has agency. Okay, that's what I hope there might be some productive synergy here. I think that's one of the reasons why Anna invited me, right? What does this look like from the point of view of social ontology, right? Is there potential for a mutually illuminating discussion of artificial agents, given that institutions and LLMs are both candidates for artificial agents? Here's the plan. First, I'm going to motivate why we should be talking about generic agency or minimal agency. I'm going to use those interchangeably. I'm then going to propose a first account of minimal agency. I'll call it the inactivist Jonesian account of minimal agency. That's after Hans Jonas. And this is, I'm going to be drawing this from the inactivist tradition. I'm going to go then critique the Jonesian account of minimal agency. And that's going to motivate yet a second account of minimal agency that I'm going to call the precedential account, but it also has roots in the inactivist tradition. Okay, and then finally, I'm going to apply, sorry, not finally, almost finally, I'm going to apply the precedential account of generic institutional, generic agency to the institutional sphere. In particular, I'm going to talk about Ronald Dworkin, and I'm going to talk about Listen Pettit. And then finally, I'm going to, in the last two slides, apply the precedential account of generic agency to the case of LLMs. And again, I flag that as the most speculative part of an already very speculative presentation. Okay, so motivating the search for generic agency. So within social ontology, here we have Kirk Lukewood. He wrote a book in 2017, a very long book, actually, the second volume of two very long books, where he essentially argued that, look, talk of corporate agency is nonsense. Since an institution could not constitute in any ordinary sense a thinking thing, talk of corporate agency is merely a convenience of language. He said, look, and he has a kind of story to tell, right? That the law talks about corporate personhood. We even attribute, right, something like rights of free speech to corporations. And he thinks that because we did this, right, that made sense to do so legally, right? It makes sense to take areas of law and apply them to novel domains. But he thinks that's all that's going on, right? This is just a very easy way of converting law in one area to law in another. But we got too excited about that, and we started thinking about these corporations as real persons. He's just like, no, it's just a convenience of language. Michael Bratman, in a review of that book, makes a claim. He says, look, I agree with you, right? That an institution could not constitute in any ordinary sense of thinking thing. Ludwig's reason for that is because he argues that corporations don't have an integrated, holistic sense of propositional attitudes, so there's kind of a Davidsonian story going on there, so they couldn't be thinking things. But then Bratman says, well, your conclusion doesn't quite follow, because we can agree with that premise, right, that institutions don't think, right, but that they still might be agents, so long as we don't confine our notion of agency to agents like us. Right? Maybe there's a broader, more generic sense of agency under which institutions fall, but would still not qualify as thinking things in this kind of full Davidsonian sense. So he makes this suggestion. In social ontology, I haven't seen this suggestion taken up. So right, this presentation is an attempt to do exactly this, follow up. Bratman, again, I haven't seen an attempt to apply a generic notion of agency to corporations. But this has been tried. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about structural functionalism. On my reading of the structural functionalists, this is exactly what they're going to try to do, is take a more generic conception of agency, one that, for example, applies to non-humans, fish, ants, and see if they can bring at least some institutions under that broader conception of agency. Okay, so here's a sociologist, Stanford, is retired, and a structural functionalist, and he makes a distinction, William Richard Scott, he makes a distinction between rational organizations and natural organizations. Rational organizations, these are going to be very familiar to us. These are organizations that are collectivities oriented towards the pursuit of relatively specific goals, right? So these are institutions that exist to better realize purposes and aims that we have, right? For example, the monetary institution, right? Monetary system helps us, facilitates our goal of exchanging goods and storing value and that kind of thing, right? Nobody thinks that the monetary system is remotely agential, okay? So we want to grant that there's these rational organizations that are tool-like, but he, following the structural functionalist, is open to the possibility of natural organizations that are collectivities who recognize the value of perpetuating the organization itself. Okay, so these are organizations that aren't just oriented to our purposes as consumers of the institution, but seem to take on a kind of self-persistence goal in and of themselves, right? And this, according to the structural functionalists, is going to be the marker of a natural system or more organic institution that's not simply a tool. And I'll note right here that this distinction between rational organizations and natural organizations very roughly corresponds to Ferdinand Poin's classic distinction between associations and communities. And communities are irreducible to an ethos of task completion, right? So I think this is a very old distinction between tool organizations or institutions as tools versus organizations and institutions as sort of quasi-living things. Okay. All right, so social ontologists, right? So we have rational organizations, tool-like organizations, we have natural organizations or organismic-like agents. And for the most part, social ontologists are on board. They think that most institutions are actually very tool-like. So here's a couple of quotes. There's John Searle. All I see when I see that picture is Willy Wonka, right? I don't know what my problem is. There's John Searle, looking very smug. And notice how his characterization of our institutions is very in this kind of tool-like mode as rational organizations. Quote, a common element that runs through all or nearly all institutions is that they are enabling structures that increase human power in many different ways. It's like, this is what they do. They help us do things that we would otherwise be unable to do. Okay, good, fine. Institutions as rational organizations as tool-like. Again, Francisco Guala, another social ontologist, and he describes institutions as instruments that help us resolve cooperation and coordination problems. And then if you look at other social ontologists, say Margaret Gilbert, right, or Michael Bradman, right, what do you get with institutions or quasi-institutional organizational structures, right? These help us walk together. These help us do things together. These help us go paint together, this kind of thing. Very tool-like. In contrast with that dominant view within social ontology, you have Philip Selznick. Now he's a structural functionalist, and he grants, yeah, sure, right? Many of our institutions have this tool-like quality, right? But what if some of these institutions, a subset, are more helpfully compared to organisms rather than tools? So where most organizations are comparable to an expendable tool, a rational instrument engineered to do a job, Selznick suggests that some institutions are better conceived as an adaptive organism, deemed to have basic needs essentially related to self-maintenance. Now that idea of being essentially related to self-maintenance, that persistence goal, okay, I'm going to keep coming back to it, and it's going to be really important, right? For the structural functionalist, the marker of an agentive institution is, right, something like existential concern. Okay, so here's Sheldon Messenger, another structural functionalist. Okay. Here's this really interesting example of what he deems to be a natural organization, an organismic institution that's more like an organism. And he talks about the Townsend Group. The Townsend Group, originated in the United States in the 1920s, is a political action committee. Okay, and what they were resolved to do, thousands, if not millions of members, right? They wanted the US government to push some sort of system that would supply pensions for the elderly. And it happened in 1936, right? But it didn't exactly happen the way that they wanted it to happen, but close enough, okay? As you're like, what happened to the Townsend organization, right? We're done, we can go home now? Not at all, right? At first, they kept trying to like, no, you did it wrong. You should do it more like us. That lasted for a couple years. And then the Townsend organization pivoted right, to a sales and recreation club. Right, they just started like selling gum. Okay, and the last member of the Townsend organization died in 1975. I found the newspaper article. Messenger in the 1950s is going to these clubs, and he's like, "Hey, do you guys want to talk about Social Security?" And they're like, "Fuck no." Right? They just wanted to talk about whatever they were talking about, like whatever. Right? They had no interest in the political side, and so Messenger's seeing this morph, right, from this political. It would be as if the Girl Scouts, right, pivoted, right, all of a sudden, right, girls stopped enrolling in the Girl Scouts, and then the Girl Scouts became Nabisco and just started selling Girl Scout cookies. Like that's the kind of shift. And Messenger's seeing this as indicative of what organisms do, right? They strive, right? They have this kind of the survival instinct. He's like, look, this is manifesting itself in the Townsend organization. This thing is more like an organism and less like a tool. I don't find this actually very convincing, right? Because you know who else this is also good for? Surviving, right? Making this kind of pivot to a sales and recreation organization. Key stakeholders in the organization, like, right? Obviously, right? I don't know that this is an indication that this organization is alive, right? But just get into the structural functional headspace, how they're seeing it. Okay, the structural functional is kind of funny sort of thing, right? At the same time that they're writing about organizations and institutions as these organisms, they could have been drawing from a lot of very interesting, right, first generation cybernetics work that would have dovetailed really nicely with a lot of work I just haven't seen a lot of evidence that they were actually drawing from that literature. In fact, I found a quote from Talcott Parsons that said, I should really look at that stuff, right? Like he was aware of it. For some reason, he wasn't actually applying it to his own work. So they're just looking for a very intuitive notion of what it is to be an organism. And to be an organism is to have one's behavior and traits organized around a survival goal, right? Intuitive enough, okay? But we might now ask, right, given that so much work has been done on the nature of organismic systems, how well does this intuition sit with our best kind of theoretical understanding of what an organism is? And to that end, I turn to the inactivists. And it turns out, right, this idea that an organism is defined as oriented towards a self-persistence goal is pretty pervasive within the inactivist literature. Okay, not entirely pervasive. I'll bring out other strands, right? But a very within the activist literature, a very famous paper, Andreas Weber and Barella's influential paper, Life After Kant, 2002. They go full in on this picture of what it is to be an organism, and they're drawing from Hans Jonas to do this. Sorry. So here's a quote that they draw that they have in the paper. A fundamental point of departure is that life says yes to itself. I love how floral this is. It's great, right? Life says yes to this. So like this bacteria, like yes to myself, right? And wishing itself to continue, it declares itself as a value, right? I'm like this little bacteria, right? Like, okay. And then Barella is taking this up. Autopoietic closure of self-production is already and inevitably a self-affirmation, saying yes to itself. Right? That shows the organism as involved in the fundamental purpose of maintaining its identity. DiPaolo, Nevin Thompson, for the inactive approach, the system is cognitive when its behavior is governed by the norm of the system's own continued existence and flourishing. And I've seen it even in this conference, right? I think this appeal to an implicit self-persistence goal as a mark of the living is right. Many speakers have either explicitly or implicitly made it, right? And I don't think this is a crazy thing to say at all, right? But I'm going to argue against it. I'm going to use the inactivist tradition against itself, right? Because I think there's strains within the inactivist literature that are beginning to resist this assumption. Okay. But let me start. Let me start here. One worry that one might have about saying that a self-persistence goal is this pervasive feature of all living organisms. It's the bacteria one, right? Notice the kind of cognitive complexity, right? That's required in order for a system to have a self-persistence goal. First of all, it has to be capable of something like Davidsonian rationality. It has to have a goal, a further goal, and then begin, right, to posit means by which that further goal is realized, right? Already, that's pretty impressive. But then the further goal ends up being, right, not to get some food or something like that. It ends up being, right, to persist, right, to have oneself persist. So there has to be a degree of self-consciousness, right? And somehow this gets projected into the future, and then you do these things in order to make sure that you survive. But really cognitively sophisticated, I'm not saying organisms don't do it, I'm just not sure that all organisms do it. So you can kind of see the worry here. This is Aaron Simmons from the animal welfare literature. I don't think he's an activist, but it captures the spirit of the worry. Right? When we witness animals' self-protective behavior in the face of threats to their lives, is it really their continued existence that they're desiring and thinking about protecting, or is it perhaps only the threat of pain that concerns them? Are most animals really concerned with their own existence? But then here you have Barrett, who is an activist working within the tradition, also expressing something like the same concern. On what grounds can we claim that the most primitive forms of life really affirm themselves? And here he's targeting Thompson. Simply by continuing to persist. What explanatory traction do we gain by ascribing normative and experiential terms like self-interest and existential concern to processes of self-maintenance? It's just like, this just feels like it's saying too much, okay? Maybe for us, right? But ants, do they have a self-persistence goal? What this suggests to me is a still more generic account of minimal agency is required if we're going to make sense of what the agency of an ant might look like. And that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to draw from 3 sources to articulate this, this still more generic account of animal agency. The first is from psychology. So psychologists make a distinction between model-based learners and model-free learners. Okay? Model-based learning recruits representations of outcomes and contingencies and values that are necessary to inform goal-directed behavior. And you can see, right, if you have a self-persistence goal, right, this forward-looking orientation, you have the goal of staying alive, and it looks like that's inviting this picture of agency in terms of being a model-based learner. But then psychologists contrast this with model-free learning. Model-free learning promotes the execution of well-honed behavioral routines without forethought or attention, right? So there's no forward orientation. In fact, it's strictly backwards looking. What have I done in the past in this situation informs what I'll do now, right? Without a thought of, and it will accomplish this further goal. Okay. Okay. I think there's an analogy between the distinction, the psychological distinction between model-based learners and model-free learners, and Dennett's Popperian creature and Dennett's Skinnerian creature. So the Popperian creature looks before it leaps, testing candidates for action against information about the world that it's stored in its brain somehow. Again, here see the model that's there, right? Like, oh, I need to accomplish this end, right? Let me consider various possibilities by which that future end is realized. That would seem to be a model-based learner. And then he contrasts this with Skinnerian creatures. Skinnerian creatures more or less randomly generate new behaviors to test in the world. Those that get reinforced are more likely to recur in similar situations in the future. Those variants born with an unfortunate disposition to mislabel positive and negative stimuli, fleeing from the good stuff and going for the bad stuff, soon eliminate themselves. They're not trying to survive, right? They will survive or not, but they're not trying to survive, right? They don't have a model or a plan by which that survival is enacted or realized. And again, back to the inactivist tradition, there is what I'm calling the inactivist Jonesian account of agents oriented towards a self-persistence goal. I think this is best exemplified by DiPaolo's very influential 2005 article, where he describes an adaptive organism as some, right? If the internal states in an adaptive organism come sufficiently close to the boundary of viability, survival, right? Tendencies are distinguished, right? So now the organism is distinguishing various tendencies or possibilities and acted upon depending on whether the states will approach that or receive from that boundary of viability. Looks like this is model-based learning, okay? And then within the inactivist tradition, more recently, maybe in the last decade, okay, there's been increasingly more emphasis on sensory motor agents, which are mentality constituted interactions. Their mentality constituting interactions are grounded and shaped by and explained by nothing more or other than the history of an organism's previous interaction. Let's see the backwards looking of that. Okay. Notice I have DiPaolo as one of the principal voices, both of the Jonesian account and the sensory motor account, right? So he tries to reconcile them. And in my reading of DiPaolo, he reconciles them by nesting the sensory motor account within the mother of all values, as he puts it, the self-persistence goal, right? And I think in that way, he does exactly the opposite thing that Dennett does. Dennett sees Skinnerian creatures as a condition for the possibility of Popperian creatures, right? So there's a real tension there. By putting up these three models and comparing them, I don't mean to suggest that they're exactly getting at the same thing. I think there's some important similarities along this line and along these lines here. But they really are recruited for different purposes. For example, the distinction between model-based learning and model-free learning is a distinction forged by developmental psychologists to talk about infant behavior, right? So for example, I've read papers where they're like, yeah, model-based learning doesn't really come online until about 10 months, right? They're really just concerned with humans and infants. And then again, an important difference between Dennett's Popperian and Skinnerian creatures versus the inactivist accounts. The activists tend to stress, right, more a phenomenal, right, a kind of richer phenomenologically and intrinsically normative version of these creatures. So there are some important differences, but there's also some important similarities that are worth attending to. So what I'm going to do, I'm just laying out the three features, and it's really just two, I'll get to that in just a second, of what I'm going to call the precedential account of generic agency. And I locate this within that second side, model-free learning. I see this as an articulation of a Skinnerian creature and as a sensory motor agent, okay? And this is something I unpacked in a recent article that I've written. So the proposed precedential account of minimal agency is a model-free Skinnerian sensory motor account, and it consists of a sensitivity to what I call primordial stochasticity. Organisms necessarily engage in quasi-random exploratory behavior because living systems are semi-ordered systems that exist near the edge of chaos, right? So they're responsive to randomness in a key way. Second, that they have what might be described as precedential or backwards-looking normativity. With repetition, these quasi-random behaviors increasingly carry the weight of precedent or the agent by serving as a standard that guides behavior when a similar situation is re-encountered in the future, right? So it just does, the agent just does something random, right, in a given situation, but that will often serve to push, right, make more probable, or we can even use something more loaded, right, serve as a rule by which its behavior is modified in the future. But then I also have to add condition number 3, natural selection on precedential norms. And this is what Dennett was getting at. Natural selection ensures that typically only the precedential norms that do not undermine survival of the behaving system will persist. That seems right. And we need this because when you look at organisms, right, most of their behavior, most of their traits do seem very much oriented towards survival. So we have to explain that. Natural selection explains it just fine, all right, without having to attribute to the organism a survival goal. Right? In some sense, they don't know what they're doing, but they're doing it very well. Okay, so I don't count condition 3 as a condition for precedential agency, as minimal agency. A moth that flies into a flame, okay, may be doing what it did in the past, and it will die, and it doesn't count as any less of an agent, right? Because it loses it gets selected against. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the precedential account of agency. Hopefully this video will work. Okay, so Thalen and Smith have an explanation of what's called the A not B error when it comes to infant behaviors, right? So infants of about 8 to 10 months, and I'll show you a video of how this works. It probably is going to be clearer than my explanation, right? They hide like a toy or a treat under a napkin, and the baby gets really used to pulling the napkin off and getting the toy or treat. And it turns out like at 8 months, if they introduce another napkin, another cover on the same table, after a few of these training trials, which is introduce the infant to what the task is, they'll openly hide the toy or the treat under the second napkin, and there's what's called perceptive reaching. The infant will still reach for to the initial location. Okay. Now, the first person to observe this was Piaget. He thought this had to do with like an infant's inability to imperfect grasp of object permanence. But I think that's wrong, and I think Thalen and Smith thinks it's wrong. They have another explanation. But before I talk about the explanation, let me just show you the video. Again, it has nothing to do with object permanence. Ignore that. Okay, there's no sound, but that's okay. The sound's really good because the baby's super cute.
There's no way to make it full screen, is there?
There isn't. Limitation of PowerPoint. Okay. So I'll just call this napkin A right there. She hides it under napkin A. And it's like, yes, toy. All right. Super happy. Okay. One more training run. If it really doesn't want to give it back. Come on, you can do it. But no, screw you. She's like, I'm just gonna take it. All right, one more training round. Hides it under napkin A. All right, you guys see where this is going? See napkin B. Hides it under napkin B. Man, it's like, what? Look at, she's looking at napkin B. She's not confused about where this thing is. You chose wrongly. She just starts crying. She's like, here, play with this thing now. All right. Again, Piaget thought this had to do with object permanence, right? But Thaler and Smith are pretty convinced that it doesn't. In most cases, right? In most cases, they'll reach at napkin A, 8 to 12 months. But also in most cases, they'll continue to look at napkin B, right? There's every indication, like when you do eye tracking, that they know exactly where that object is, right? And they reach for A anyway. And their explanation for this is actually these training rounds where they're introducing the infant, right, to the activity, right? It was just like kind of disregarded, right? Well, of course, they need to understand what it is that we're doing here. But in fact, the way that they read it is they're actually training the infant. They're building a sensory motor routine, right? One way of sort of seeing what's happening here, right, is you can see almost a conflict between the inner Skinnerian creature in the infant, the one that's just doing what it's always done, at least in the past 3 minutes, and the inner Popperian creature who knows exactly that that toy is under B, right? I want that, and there's like literally watching her hand reach for the wrong place. Crap, right? It's kind of tension, right? All right. So we see something like the Popperian feature, something like the precedential account in the behavior of young infants, but it gets better than it. Okay, so very famous experiments by Novick and Weiner, and they took genetically identical E. coli, okay, and they put them, they exposed them to lactose, which they love, but a lactose imitate, right? A chemical that was almost like lactose, but not quite right. Genetically identical, right? And different populations of these genetically identical E. coli, they just freaked out. They responded in a variety of different ways. Some of them produced enzymes, right? Some of them started rolling, right? They just didn't know what to do. And some of those strategies were effective. And some of those strategies weren't. And those E. coli died, right? But again, when you see this, see the analogy with the infant, right? They're just trying stuff. They're not trying to survive. They're not trying. They're literally just behaving randomly. And then once they behave randomly in one way, what they found is that they tend to continue to behave as they did upon that first random trial, right? So if they have response A, right, they'll do, in all likelihood, they'll do response A again. Even if, for example, they reintroduce sorry, did I say lactose? I think it's glucose. Even if they reintroduce glucose to the field, right? They continue to do it. What's even more remarkable is that subsequent generations, right, acquire these habits, right, through epigenetic factors, right? They just do this. So they're learning, but they're learning in the Skinnerian way, not in this Popperian way. Okay. Oh, one more thing about the infant and the A not B error. So you might think, oh, this is just reinforcement learning, right? Really what the infant's trying to do is get the toy. And that looks like very forward-looking, like, oh, I want the toy, so I'm going to do this. And then they just kind of miscalculate about how best to get the toy. But they have this other experiment, let's call it the simplified A not B experiment, where they just put an infant in front of 2 napkins. Okay? Didn't show the infant a toy, didn't do anything. They're just like, here's 2 napkins, right? Maybe in like 30% of the time, the infant will reach for one or the other of the napkins, right? The other 70% of the time, the infant just looks around. Right? Just randomly reaches for a napkin. Okay? No toy under their napkin, no reinforcement, right? External reinforcement. But if an infant reached for the napkin, right, almost 100% chance they would reach for the napkin again. right? So there's no further goal, right? It looks like, right, if we had to put this in sort of intentional terms, the reason why they're doing X is because they did X. And it just bottoms out there. They didn't do X in order to get some further goal, right? A toy or survival or something like that. I don't know. But if I could use John Fisher's vocabulary, right, there's a sort of mode of reasons responsiveness that this infant and these equali have, such that, right, they do X simply because X was done. And it's the simplicity of that thought that I want you to sort of try to grab onto, right? We don't want to overstate what's happening, right? Maybe that living creatures are just the kind of creatures that take precedent as a reason to act. And again, don't overread the word reason, right? That's just what a living creature is. And then you might say, well, why are so many of those actions then, right, so conducive to survival and reproduction? Well, that's why the third condition, welcome to natural selection, right? But it may be the case that that's right. That doesn't mean that they're doing it in order to survive. Now, by the time you get creatures like us, right, Gregorian creatures, Popperian creatures, right, we can begin to reflect and add more content to that very basic mode of reasons responsiveness. I do X because I did X, right? But I think it would be a mistake, right, to jump too quickly when it comes to those impositions. Okay, so back to social ontology. We just have a few more slides here. All right, this is the model of minimal agents. Minimal agents are such that they take random stochastic behavior as something like a non-episodic reason to do it again. It just bottoms out there. So I think this is not a very well-known passage of Ronald Dworkin, but I think it makes sense of a lot of his views, right? So Ronald Dworkin, philosopher of law, stresses integrity, and the importance of integrity consists in the importance of taking history seriously, right, when it comes to a legal system. So the history of a social practice defines the communal groups to which we belong and the obligations that attach to these, right? A law that exhibits integrity is a law that's sensitive to the force of its own precedent. And not all legal systems do that, right? Sometimes, like you can imagine, like a king who just like, right, ignores all the decisions that she made or he made in the past, right, and just redecides afresh every single time. That's not integrity, right? But integrity, right, a law of integrity is one that it remains minimally responsive to the history of its own decisions. And you might think, well, okay, that's cool. So it looks like you have this analogy. Maybe, right, maybe we could say that a law that's characterized by integrity is something like a more organismic system, right? If that's a condition for the minimal agency. But Dworkin doesn't think that, right? Wrong. He does. My account of political integrity takes personification seriously, as if a political community really were some special kind of entity distinct from the actual people who are its citizens. Worse, it attributes moral agency and responsibility to this distinct entity. For when I speak of a community being faithful to its own principles, I mean that the community has its own principles that it itself can honor or dishonor, that's precedent. That it itself can act in good bad faith with integrity or practically just as people can. If there's a problem here, it's that he overstates the kind of agency that's at play here, right? He describes it as personification, right? But persons do way more than just remain sensitive to their own history of response, right? We are capable of model-based, in addition to model-free learning, right? We're Gregorian creatures, right? Persons do more than this, right? But he's getting at the right, and I think he's wrong to attribute moral responsibility to the state, right? To the state itself as a sort of agent. If you're simply a Skinnerian creature, I'm not sure that you're quite to the point where we can ascribe moral responsibility to you, right? But so he overstates the point, but he still makes the point, right? A responsiveness to one's own history of response, right, is a marker of generic agency. Okay, one last social ontologist, then I'm gonna move on to LLMs and I'll be done. So Listen Pettit posit an impossibility theorem, and then go on to solve this impossibility theorem. The possibility theorem is distantly related to Arrow's impossibility theorem. And here's what they worry about, right? If a condition for the possibility of being a group agent is that there's a relatively high degree of rationality, is the word that they use, but I prefer to think of it in terms of unity of purpose or coherence. How are you going, if these are the individuals of the group, and they're differently oriented, right, in different directions that are incompatible, right, how are you going to achieve an appropriate level of group level coherence or unity of purpose, given the various, right, the disunity of all the agents that consist of the group? Right? This is the impossibility theorem. Like, we can't get there, right? At least not without violating 4 different desiderata. Now, one way to do this is just to ignore, say, this is individual 1, individual 2, and individual 3. We just ignore the wishes of individual 2 and 3, then we can get there, right? But that violates the dictator condition, right? So how can we do it while taking seriously, in some ways, the agency of the group's constituent parts? And our solution is really interesting, right? It suggests, well, maybe there's a priority procedure such that if the individuals of that group are sufficiently responsive to precedent, right? So the individuals can do what they want so long as they do what they want, right, within the confines of the tradition of the traditions of the community that they're part of, right? Then, right, the appropriate level of group level coherence can be achieved without eradicating the agency of the group's parts, right? And so they make this explicit appeal to precedent, which I think dovetails really nicely with the account of minimal agency that I'm trying to talk about here. All right, this is the part of the talk that I'm most nervous about, because I don't know very much about LLMs. I've learned a tremendous amount over the last 2 days, and I'm grateful to all the speakers. However, in thinking about this, I think I actually gravitated to some of the same conclusions that I've heard reflected in at least some of the talks here. So the first point I want to make is that an LLM satisfies the precedential account of agency. It satisfies these 3 conditions. Right, a language model begins by registering a word or a letter, an input, and randomly guessing which word or letter will be correct. Right, so there's the stochastic process. Right, right. The first time they're just like, I don't know. There's a space, semicolon. Good, right? And then what happens? And then the next time there's a space, it's going to follow with the semicolon. Same. Okay, I'm sure it's much more complicated, but hopefully, at least in broad outlines, this is correct. Right, so it establishes a kind of rule for each of those training cycles. Unfortunately, there's also natural selection. So then you go back, right, to the training set, and you're like, how often is a semicolon followed by a space in your training set? Oh, not very often. Try again. Okay, well, maybe after a space, I should try a T, right? And it's going to be bad, right? So it's this really kind of naturally selective process, such that it seems to me LLMs count as genuine agents in this very minimal or generic sense. Okay, like, and notice I'm not apologizing, like real agents, right? Skinnerian agents, not pseudo agents, nothing like that, right? Real agents. It's just not agents like we are, except they are like agents like we are, because we're also Skinnerian agents. We're not just Skinnerian agents. And we see this kind of reflected in the behavior of the infant. So in LLMs, test and generate modality of learning is model-free and backwards looking. Contra the Jonesian account of minimal agency and LLMs norms are not derived from anything like a survival imperative. It's not trying to survive. It's just because there's a process of natural selection, right? And the conditions for surviving is that it produces an output that's more or less recognizable by people like us, right? It ends up producing norms that are conducive to the conditions for survival, but it's not trying to survive. I don't think I'm saying anything new to anyone here. So 2 implications, last slide, about applying the precedential account of generic agencies to LLMs. And this I'm just going to read, partially because I feel like I don't have enough, even a grasp of what I'm saying, right, to ad-lib it. So here it is. Okay, the first is that minimal precedential agents are relatively cheap. Okay, they're not hard to find. But I also want to say they're not ubiquitous, right? They're not so easy to find that we can find them everywhere, okay? So LLMs would seem to be minimal agents. By contrast, solar systems, hydrological cycles, and Bernard cells display regularities. They also might behave in random ways, but do not seem, and this is the key point, do not seem to have the capacity to use their own random behavior as the basis for the production of a novel regularity. Okay? Now, that's an invitation for a counterexample. Right, so if those of you in the audience can point to something that's not an organism, but can use its own random behavior as the basis for a novel regularity, all right, that's a problem for my account, maybe. And I'd invite that, right? I really need to think through this more carefully than I've been able to. Right, to inflect this point in a Kantian mode, sorry, I'm not British. Minimal agents are such that they can act based on their own self-imposed rules. They're self-binding, okay? But unlike a Kantian mode, those rules are grounded neither in heteronymous influences, nor in the moral law, but in primordial stochasticity. Right? That's what it is to be a minimal agent, is to be capable of binding oneself to a novel rule set. And I think that's what it is to be a Skinnerian agent. Okay. Okay. Here's the second point, and again, I think I've heard this point echoed in a lot of the talks. So I don't pretend that this is anything novel. Maybe it's at best maybe come up with a new way of saying an old thing. Okay. So agents, Skinnerian agents, they're cheap, but not particularly ubiquitous. But what I want to say is what's expensive about minimal agency, right, isn't that we can find a system that's a minimal agent, but it's what the system looks like after it's been honed over millions of years of evolution, right? And I don't know, just an analogy, tell me if this works for you, right? Wine's not that hard to find, okay? But what we value is aged wine, right? Wine that's been sufficiently aged, okay? Minimal agents aren't that hard to find, right? But minimal agents that are intelligible to us, right? Because, right, we've, right, honed these habits over the course of billions of years or millions of years, billions of years. That, right, to find agents like us, Skinnerian agents like us, are actually difficult to find. Okay, LLMs are fascinating because they occupy the uncanny valley of intelligibility. It's tempting to conclude from this that their uncanniness is because they're not really agents. But I don't want to go in that direction. I want to say, no, they're real agents. That's not what accounts for their uncanniness. Another explanation is possible. Perhaps they are genuine agents who have evolved in a different world than we have, but a world that bears a mediated relationship to our own. The training set against which an LLM's self-imposed norms are selected constitutes a kind of twin Umwelt or twin Earth of propositions about our own Umwelt or Earth. They live in a twin Earth that looks a lot like our Earth, but is not exactly our Earth. Thus, what's uncanny about LLMs is explained less in their failure to qualify as genuine agents, although it's also true that they're not Popperian or Gruberian agents in the way that we are, but in the environments that such agents occupy. And it's this gap that remains, even if we could somehow launder the training set so that it would be relatively free from bias and bullshit. If this is correct, this points to the importance of embodiment, of actual situated motor cognition, as stressed by inactivists and many others, including people in this room. What happens when an embodied LLM makes a prediction, not about which word follows after the word cliff, but about what follows after stepping off of it?